And that was kind of an epiphany for me that I can do what I love. And given my history doing sales and juggling a lot of information and my upbringing, it actually was a pretty perfect fit. So 2001, I kind of made this decision that I was going to open a gallery. And at the time, people thought I was crazy, to be frank.
That was New York gallerist Bruce Silverstein telling me about the moment he decided to step away from his lucrative Wall Street career and step into the unknown by opening his own gallery. Now, although the photography fair presented by AIPAD finished on the weekend, this episode was recorded in the lead up to the annual event, and I hope you'll enjoy it in the afterglow of the 2025 edition of the Photography Fair, the oldest and longest running art fair for photography, which takes place at the Park Avenue Armory in New York City. My guest today is Bruce Silverstein. We talk about his upbringing and how his father, a photographer, played a huge role in his appreciation of the art form, how his career on Wall Street afforded him the ability to start collecting photography for himself, as well as his ultimate decision to go all in on his passion and become a leading voice in the field. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome to the program. You're listening to Subtext Discourse Art World podcast, highlighting unique perspectives on contemporary art and photography. I'm your host, Michael Dooney. Now, without further ado, I hope you'll enjoy our conversation. Bruce Silverstein, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome, and congrats on your new space. I heard you just moved into a new gallery.
Yes, just opened it yesterday. So exciting time.
Yeah, how was the launch and how was the reception and everything?
The reception, it was down to the wire in terms of getting the show open in time for the reception. It was a 4-month renovation process, but the opening went well and a lot of energy, so it was exciting.
And was it a long time coming, like moving into a new location?
You know, it's something, I used to have a ground floor space on 24th Street. And for the last, 6-7 years, we moved to our kind of upstairs space. We had 2 different spaces, which was very productive and a bit liberating, to be frank. But it got to the point where I felt like I needed a change. I needed more space again to be able to create, do interesting shows. It felt a little bit limited. And I needed a space that was conducive for showing larger works, not just photography, but all art forms. So this seems to be a perfect fit.
Oh, so you're not just focused on photography, you show other mediums.
Yeah, well, that's been true for quite some time. I mean, I think, as you know, the kind of definition of what is a photograph has broken down. So where do you draw the line in terms of what you're showing if you're purely a photography gallery, if you will? And of course, so many photographers were working in other medium. So it becomes problematic when you're representing an artist or an estate and they're doing other work that's not photographic. So we've been, for a long time, I would say for most of the time in my career, we've been showing non-photographic works mixed in, but with not the same sort of focus and intensity that we will be moving forward.
Yeah, wow. How did you get into photography to start with?
Yeah, it's my father is a photographer. He's been shooting since the late 40s. His name is Larry Silver. Still shooting today. He's 90 years old.
Wow, really?
Yeah. So I was raised on a steady diet of photography from a very, very young age. My father used to take me out shooting with him. I was raised in Westport, Connecticut. My father was raised in the Bronx. And then we moved to Westport when I was, 5 years old, 6 years old. So my father would go basically hunting for photographs, which is the way, his generation did it, and driving around. And I would be with him in the car and kind of engaging in that process with him from a very young age. I mean, photography was a big topic in my home all the time. And I have memories of my father banging his fist on the table, offended at someone's comment about photography being a hobby or whatever the case may be. So we spent a lot of time looking at photo books together. My father was really interested in music. So we would sit in the living room, he would have music going, and we'd just basically look at pictures. So that was my childhood. And I was more interested in drawing and sculpting. Photography was more of just sort of like, getting into what my father was into. So I didn't ever think that this would become a career path, to be honest with you. But looking back on it, I was in, photography 101 my entire childhood. So I started collecting photography in my early 20s. I think it was a byproduct of being indoctrinated from such a young age on how underappreciated, undervalued, and accessible fine art photography was in terms of, the value. So when I had an opportunity to start I was working in finance, and I had the ability to buy some things. And I think being raised by an artist, parents that did their best, but it wasn't always easy financially. Buying photography felt like it was an acceptable an acceptable form of purchase, as opposed to some fancy car or whatever at the time. Yeah, it became a passion very quickly.
Oh, so you didn't start out as a photographer then? Like, were you a photographer as well?
No, I never. Interestingly enough, I didn't learn how to use a camera until I was 22 years old, and I think that's what happens when you feel like something has been kind of ever present in your life. It was like, you know what, I have no interest. My father used to try to teach me, and it would drive me crazy, as it would probably most kids. He would sit me down, and I felt like he was going too slowly in his explanations. It would always start off the same. This is a camera, it is a box, and it was like I would lose it immediately.
Yeah.
And he used to tell me, we would go out taking pictures. He would be taking pictures, and I would say, "What about this? What about that?" And my father would say, "Well, why don't you take the picture?" And I'd be like, "No, that's not for me." So interestingly enough, after I graduated from college and I moved to New York City, I decided that it was time to learn how to use a camera. So I took a kind of an evening course at Stuyvesant High School, and the teacher walks in, and I'm sitting there with my desk with my notes, and he starts out and says, "This is a camera. It is a box." And it was the same exact thing. But somehow when it's not coming from your father, it's easier to absorb.
Yeah. So did you have then the same, like this sort of experience a lot of other people growing up with photography have, where you have this sort of magic in the dark room and it's like, now I'm hooked and everything else? Or
no, I didn't have that. My father tried to turn me on to that. He always, he had a studio here in the city. He was doing commercial work, and I would go into the dark room, and I thought it was cool, but it was never, it wasn't a magic moment for me. And looking back on it, it should have been.
Yeah. But
that's not where my head was. I was interested in drawing. That was my passion from a young age. But my father, he was a huge impact on me. He was constantly taking me to shows. We really didn't go on any family vacations. It was not something that we could do, but going to museums constantly, as well as flea markets and antique shows and things like that. I was raised with all of that. And he really, I basically learned through seeing, looking at books. And I remember, it wasn't about reading the book, reading a book on Cartier-Bresson. It would be about just turning the pages, looking at the images, and talking about kind of, more intuitive ideas about the work. So I feel like I learned kind of the language of photography from a very young age, but not from an academic standpoint, which probably benefited me looking back on it, because I didn't come into the field with any kind of preconceived notions in terms of, oh, this person is important because this, there was a book on them, or they've had shows. It's more about what appealed to me when I was looking. So, which was helpful when I first opened the gallery, because I was obliged to, create shows that hadn't been done before, because I was so kind of late in the game, so to speak. When you talk about some of the other dealers that have been around already for 30 years, many of the most kind of well-known artists were already represented.
Yeah. So when was it then, like the time between you working in finance and collecting photography to opening a gallery? Like, you must have amassed like a big collection before you started.
Well, I started collecting when I was 23, and I was fortunate enough at that point to have been kind of in the right time and place in my career. I had started a energy brokerage firm with a partner, basically putting together buyers and sellers of natural gas and and oil and electricity. And when we first opened it, it was at the time when natural gas markets were deregulating. So it was a brand new market. And it was a business that was done a lot over the phone, which turned out to be a very good thing for me because I was really an introvert at that point in my life. And the phone became a place where I felt very comfortable. And what ended up happening was I developed really strong relationships with my clients. So I fortunately I was doing quite well, certainly for my age, and it afforded me the ability to start collecting photography. That was, I went through the process that most people who start in this field go through, which is trying to figure out how the whole system works. It was complicated. I remember, some of the first pictures that I purchased, how difficult it was to make the decision because of the variables that existed. I remember, I think one of the first pictures I purchased was Arnold Newman's portrait of Igor Stravinsky, a photograph that I'd always loved. And I remember going to AIPAD at that time, and there was there were 5 different booths that had the same picture on the wall, different sizes and different, print dates and this and that. And it was just impossible to figure out. So that was a good experience because it really, learning that way really teaches you some of the challenges other people have in navigating this world. So I, finally kind of jumped, made the leap of faith and purchased a print, which was, I don't remember, maybe it was a 11 by 14 print, later print for $2,000. And, it was, okay, well, that's 11 by 14 for 2,000, and 14 by 17 is 2,200. And, I did it. I jumped in and I bought the picture, and it was just, taking that home and it becoming part of my life and my family in a way. It's like adopting a child, and to feel like, oh my God, this thing is now part of my life forever. And to have been able to afford to do that was just, was exhilarating at the time, especially, looking at these pictures since I was, a kid. So it, from that time to when I became a dealer, and a lot had already transpired. I very quickly became addicted, if you will, which is, a term that a lot of people use, but it was more of addicted to the opportunity that was out there to acquire these, masterpieces that were, soon after I really started just focusing on vintage photography.
Yeah.
Because I really appreciated the object quality, the paper, the patina, if you will, the term that I, had understood in the, sculpture world, but really never talked about that with my father. He was not that, interested in the concept of vintage, if you will, but it was something that I really, really loved. So I began to, really focus on vintage works. And I also knew, frankly, I looked at these things as, one day I might need to sell them. And I was just understanding my father's life and how difficult things can be. When I bought these works of art, I really wanted to make sure that, if I ever had to, I could sell them. So, it still was a significant amount of money for me. And I think I did carry a bit of, some of that weight of being raised by an artist, if you will, the financial weight of it. So that was a whole process, learning about dating prints and different papers and stamps and signatures and, all those variables, which I think is really you only learn through trial and error. And the fact that I was actually buying works made it so that I felt like I had to learn it. I wanted to learn it. And it then became a lot of the hunt of finding things that I loved. And I think in terms of collecting, it was very, because I had been looking at pictures so long, I kind of knew when I saw something, whether I loved it or not. And it was a very quick thing. It hit me, which made it, I guess, second nature a bit for me.
Yeah. No, I think definitely when you were speaking before about your upbringing with photography, you've kind of had an education in visual language, and you can, it's like when people ask you, what do you like? You're like, I know it when I see it, but it's very difficult to put it into words because you sort of have this database of images in your head, and then you can recognize, okay, this is something different, or this is special, or this is something that I should pay attention to because you've not seen it yet, and you've got, tens of thousands of other images as a reference in your mind.
Absolutely. I think it's almost like you develop a database of information and imagery. And with that database, you have context. And to understand what is new, you have to kind of understand, what is old, what you've seen already. And that takes time, and that's something that is also a great pleasure to learn and to see.
Yeah. So you said, I guess you had some success in your initial career, but when was it then that you thought, I'm going to step away from that and just do photography? Like, I'm going to open a gallery.
I think collecting photography became a passion for me, and it really appealed to me on so many different levels. Obviously, the love of the image and the history, and there was certainly a kind of a connection to my father through photography, through collecting. It was a way to connect with him, and we look at the works that I bought, and it became something that was really what I did for fun. It started out where, okay, after work on Friday, I would go to the galleries. And then, of course, you start getting into the openings and the art fairs. But for me, a lot of it really kind of what the appeal was the hunt. And I think that was also something, that's something that I always had from a young age. As I said, my father would take me to flea markets and tag sales. And it was exciting when you found something, special. And at the time when I started collecting, it was kind of the early stages of the internet. And I remember I was constantly buying old catalogs, old auction catalogs, and, ones from the 70s. It was just amazing to look at these and see what was out there at that time and how things had changed. And I was also, as a kid, I was interested in metal detecting, and I collected coins, and I collected baseball cards and searching for these things. So I always had that joy of hunting in that way, which also benefited me on Wall Street because, when a client wanted to try to find something, I was able to find it for them. So after I had started this operation for a company called Yamani, which was their energy division, and it had grown to 100 people around the world, and the markets were evolving. It became less of a negotiated market and more of transactional, very fast paced. And it was just hard to constantly be, moving at that pace with that intensity, and also dealing with the management of staff and trying to grow the operation. And frankly, it wasn't bringing me the pleasure it brought me before. And that had been for a while, but I was fortunately, I was able to convert the money into pleasure, which was photography. And at a certain point, it became pretty clear. Well, I was unhappy doing what I was doing. And I just basically on my 30th birthday, right around that time, I was like, I'm done.
Wow.
And it wasn't, I'm done. I've got, oodles of money and I can just live retired. It was, I put away a decent amount, and I had a great collection that I've been building over that 7 years. And I just wanted to be away from it. And I needed kind of that downtime to figure out what I wanted to do next in my life. And, it took a while before I kind of came to this realization that maybe I am what I do, and what I do is I spend my time searching and hunting and photography. And that was kind of an epiphany for me that I can do what I love. And actually, given my history doing, sales and kind of juggling a lot of information and my upbringing, it actually was a pretty perfect fit. So 2001, I kind of made this decision that I was going to open a gallery. And at the time, people thought I was crazy, to be frank.
Yeah.
People in the field who I'd become friends with were like, why are you doing that?
Yeah.
I think they thought I was naive in that I picked, that everything would be just so fun. It's what I learned later is it's a lot of work.
Yes. Yeah.
And, it's not what it looks like when you come into an opening and, everything is perfect and the dealer's standing there as like the Wizard of Oz. It's like it took a lot to get to that point.
How was it then in those early days, like that kind of learning curve and switching from kind of being the guy that you want to come into the gallery, that was you, to being on the other side of the relationship?
Yeah, it was incredibly exciting. I mean, it was exciting from the standpoint of, just doing something completely new and trying to navigate through that without any kind of, background in it. Most of the people in the field, the gallery owners, well, a lot of them had parents that were doing that, or they started out working their way up and eventually they became the dealer. I didn't do it that way. I just was like, I'm going to open a gallery. And with that was a real kind of sense of adventure. I was at that time in 2001, I didn't even know that Chelsea existed. And I lived in West Village. I didn't know there was, my idea of where to look for art was, in New York City was 57th Street and Soho. That's where the galleries were, that at least the photo galleries. So I had started looking for a space and I was looking at Broadway and a lot of the other dealers, were down there. And the realtor said, well, what about Chelsea? And she took me to a space. I had a kind of my budget wasn't huge. And while I did well, on Wall Street, I would say a good amount of my assets were already locked up into photography. So I really was kind of pretty conservative in terms of where I was starting. I found this space on the first floor walk up of a townhouse on 22nd Street, right after the High Line crosses over. And it was about 500 square feet in raw space. And I remember when I decided to rent that space, which was $5,000 a month,
wow.
I had the record for the most expensive per square foot gallery in all of Chelsea. And but it was the only gallery in all of Chelsea that was 500 square feet. So that's so I went through that process of trying to figure out the design, and then I made my own website. Even though I had no background in computer programming, I used whatever I think it was called Front Page and made my own site and updated it myself. And I did everything. I was the only employee at the Bruce Silverstein Gallery.
Yeah.
And it was fantastic. Just sanding the walls and learning how to hang pictures and scanning and inventorying. I learned it all from scratch and all from trial and error. And it felt good to be using my hands and enjoying that process. But it was challenging because at the time, I'd been away from Wall Street for, I had started something with my brother and didn't go where we wanted it to go. And when I decided to open this gallery, I remember my father thought I was crazy.
Yeah.
And he was like, why are you doing this? Are you doing this for me? And I was like, no. He's like, he just couldn't believe that I would walk away from a career that afforded me, the opportunities that he didn't have to actually, travel and not be stressed like he was. And so I had just signed this lease to this new space, and I received a call from someone who I used to work with that wanted to know if I was interested in coming back to the business. He had just joined a new company, and it had been a couple of years, and I was starting to miss some of those benefits I did enjoy eating out and traveling, and I didn't realize how easy I had it. People think that Wall Street is, like somehow that it's, at least what I was doing when I would do a transaction, I put a buyer and seller together, and maybe I have Goldman Sachs on one phone and Mobile Oil on the other phone, and we do a transaction, and I write a ticket and I drop it into a basket, and magically it gets, someone takes it from the basket and all that paperwork gets done. And I'm not involved in any of that. But here it's very different. So I decided I would go on this interview and see what they had to say. And there was basically offered an opportunity to do some, run this operation worldwide. And it was really what I had wanted to do in my previous position. And it was, very, very well compensated. But here I was opening my first show. Like literally this came about right when I was opening my first show. And I remember my father was like, take the job. Are you crazy? And I'm like, Dad, I really need to do this. I've gone all the way with this. I found it. I've got the artists lined up. So I said, thank you very much. Let me see how things go. And that was in, April of 2001. And in September of 2001, many of the people I interviewed with were dead because it was Cantor Fitzgerald.
Oh, man.
And a lot of my friends, I lost a lot of my friends, in the World Trade Center on 9/11. So my father admitted that I was right. Finally.
Yeah, wow.
But, that's sometimes things are, counterintuitive. Anyways, that's how that was the opening of the gallery.
Man, that's heavy.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just had a lot of goosebumps, and it's like, wow, that's a lot of that's a lot to process. I mean, if you need a sign, you made the right choice. Wow.
It's certainly I think it was the right choice on so many ways. It was, I really enjoyed curating, and it was because it was such an organic process for me. A lot of people, I think what I've learned over time through my experiences, people that they study, they go to art school and they get a degree, a master's degree, and they, they've got a tremendous amount of information of art history, which is great. I wish I had that information. On the other hand, you're also taught a system of rules that kind of like are the accepted norms that this is a fact. This artist is great. This artist was influential on this artist. And those facts become part of your, database, as we say. And I didn't have that. I really just had a visual history of images. So my experience and the images, many of the images were based upon images that I had seen going through the drawers of the dealers. I would go there and they would try to what about this? What about that? And I think I was a bit of a pain in the ass for them because they couldn't figure out, I'd be like, just let me go through your stuff. And, often they would separate their drawers into kind of categories. Okay. And one of the categories was basically, stuff I can't sell, otherwise known as like the junk drawers, the stuff that just kind of accumulates. And I remember seeing in those drawers, a lot of interesting things. For example, one of my most favorite artists is Aaron Siskind, the only photographic member of the Abstract Expressionist group, and someone who I had purchased at auction, that I had collected early on. And his early work, really from the 40s and 30s, was not fully abstract. They were transitional, if you will, but extraordinary pictures that didn't really have a collector base. So one of I think it was my second show, was really looking at that early period, which I broke out into being 1935 to 1951, which was basically when he had left the Photo League, and then 1951 when he joined the Art Institute of Chicago. And you can see, if you start to lay out the work, you can see the evolution of the ideas that became kind of central to his motifs, his career. So, for example, like the glove, there's this famous image of a glove on the ground. And you start to see how that glove kind of evolves into almost like this motherwell, shape. You see how he evolves into an abstract expressionist. And you see really because of how he was showing at the Charles Egan Gallery in the 40s. He was friends with a lot of the Abex painters, introduced quite a few of them to the gallery. And when you start to look at those works and put them side by side with what the Abex painters were doing, you could see that some of the ideas, how they evolved and how he influenced these ideas and how they evolved from nature. And these are things you could really only kind of realize when you lay it out and like when you look at enough pictures and you start to look at them and place them on the walls and, reorganize them, ideas materialize. So I put together this show. I think it was called Transformation. It was documenting that move from being a documentary photoleaguer to an abstract expressionist. And I ended up getting a huge review in the New York Times, which was like just unfathomable to me. And that was really kind of my, starting point. And I remember the first art fair I did at that time, which was Photo LA. All the dealers, when it came out during the fair, and all the dealers were coming up to me and hugging me and high-fiving me. And it was really beautiful. The community that existed back then in photography, it was, everyone had that kind of common goal, which was to raise photography. And these people had done it for a long time already. So I was the new kid.
Yeah. That's really nice that they kind of warmly welcomed you and then they were proud of you. That's like, yeah, here's another guy that's really carrying the torch forward.
Yeah. Yeah, it was super nice.
So within New York then, I'm just trying to think where to go next. This has been really good. This episode of Subtext Discourse is brought to you by the Association of International Photography Art Dealers, otherwise known as AIPAD. The association encourages public support of fine art photography by acting as a collective voice for the dealers and galleries committed to the medium. Through communication and education that enhances the confidence of the public, museums, institutions, and others in responsible fine art photography dealing, go to www.apad.com to find out more. Well, I guess we're talking in the context of AIPAD. So how many years after you started your space and that you were involved, did you attend AIPAD?
Well, AIPAD was really a wonderful fair. What I mean was, from a collector's standpoint at that time, it was amazing. And it was held at the Hilton Hotel. And for a new collector to go into this place and see, dealers from around the world who are all showing their best stuff and so many in one place, it was like the highlight of the year. And so I knew when I opened the gallery, it was like, I want to do AIPAD. That was a fantasy. So I started as soon as they let me in. I think they may have had some rule. They had to be a dealer for 3 years or whatever the case may have been. And maybe they even gave me an exemption on it because I've been involved for a long time. But
when did you join? Like, when did you become part of the family?
I think it was probably around 2002. And so that puts me, I've been doing it for 23 years now, which makes me still a newbie, I think.
Yeah.
It's been a real, so important to the field for so long, and a place where people gather and exchange ideas and connect, a meeting point for curators from around the world. And the fact that it's in New York makes it a place where people want to be. They come here, they go to the show, they go to, other galleries, museums. Really kind of, it's an iconic fair.
Just thinking when you said you've been part of it for 24 years and you opened your space in 2001, the internet was still a bit of a new thing. Sort of 10 years later, we got social media and Web 2 or whatever you want to call it. Yeah. And even maybe post-corona, where we've had a lot of things become more online, as someone that deals with a lot of vintage photography, how have you felt the change over that sort of 2 decades?
Well, it's been huge changes. I would say the whole kind of relationship between the dealer client, at least that I've witnessed, has changed. It was all about the kind of personal visit, the one-on-one, the talking, the intimate kind of conversations about the art and turning people on to the work, which was so important in photography because there still has always been that kind of educational component and these elements that people have struggled to overcome, this notion of vintage and, all these definitions. But when someone comes in and you can show them two prints of the same image, and one done in of Andre Cortez's fork done in 1926 versus a print that was made in 1976, and they look at the two, it's instantly understandable. And it's also quite effective when they see the two to want to perhaps put a little more into it financially to get that vintage piece. And so that kind of intimacy, particularly after, I think COVID was kind of the last nail in it, where it really changed people's kind of habits in terms of going out, going to galleries. People will buy art sight unseen, which is good and bad. It's certainly, they're not picking up on the subtleties of what might make a particular piece more beautiful than another, or, like they're not seeing in person. Things can be very different. People should see things in person, but, now it's, let's have a video conference call so you can look at it. Yeah. And that's already a big deal. So there are people that will buy things sight unseen, and we make a real effort to send them great images and condition reports and maybe even a video that shows it under raking light and whatever the case may be. But that's a major change, and that's something that it makes it difficult for us as dealers to transmit the information, to help people connect, to get them excited about the work. And on the other hand, people will buy expensive things very quickly in a way that, back in my day, you want to go take a look at it. You may even want to go take a second look at it. So I would say that's a major change. Certainly, if you want to talk about the major changes within the field, I think it's interesting how maybe, and only through the perspective of time as a dealer does one learn kind of like these cycles. I'm not just talking financial cycles, but cycles in what appeals to people, and how, back when I first opened, everyone was interested in 1950s photography. And the new thing was to show artists from the 70s, to dig into the 70s a little further than the handful of artists that were being kind of promoted over and over again. And now it feels like, for the new generation of people out there, 90s, wow, look at that. That's 1990s. So, and the 50s are like, that's like ancient times.
Ancient, yeah.
So God forbid you pull out a picture from 1910, with a picture of a couple of people fishing in a pond, that, beautiful photograph of clouds by Alfred Stieglitz or whatever the case may be. And it's like, it's just another universe. So, that's kind of something that I wouldn't have ever anticipated without the experience of time, to understand how these things become history and not as relevant, if you will.
Yeah. I always never know how to feel when people talk about things from the 90s and say how it's vintage or whatever. It's like, I was a teenager then, man.
I know. But I there's so much to talk about. We've only been here an hour. There's some really important issues going on right now that need to be kind of acknowledged and understood. The reason why, beyond what we discussed in terms of, this new space, is really where we find ourselves in the photography world is, and it's a function of people doing what needed to be done at the time, which was promote photography in the 70s and 80s because no one else was doing it. So because of that, you had kind of like, these photography galleries proliferating, which was super important. And the people who did this deserve so much credit for, fighting the tough battle to bring photography and to be considered an art form with the goal of an equal art form. At the same time, by not integrating these artists with other art forms, artists doing other art forms, they perpetuated a isolationist kind of perspective that made it difficult for those who were interested in other art forms to understand how photography fit in the picture. And by not also exploring how photographers were not just equal, they were leaders. And, it is truly the most conceptual, dominating art form in history. I mean, these artists no longer had to draw what they saw. They didn't have to go through that process of first I got to learn how to draw, then I'll start, and then I'll be, then I'll move into abstraction or whatever the case. Literally, it's about how one's mind thinks differently than another and how that translates into this photograph. And so, extraordinarily conceptual. These artists, they weren't just artists, they were scientists, just like Da Vinci and all the great, Renaissance artists in history. And I've always felt like my goal, my place in this needed to be, because of my background and interest in all art and my location in Chelsea, was to show photography integrated with other art forms, but show photography as kind of not just sprinkled in there like, a little bit of salt in a recipe, but actually the main ingredient. And I've tried to do that. It takes, a lot of time and effort to curate those shows that place, where I had, for example, Lisette Modell, an artist who I was raised to think was a really kind of just quirky street photographer and, part of the Photo League. And in the photography folklore, that's really what she was. But the reality was that she came from Austria and she studied under Arnold Schoenberg, who was a German expressionist composer. And if you think about it, at that time with German expressionism, with Gross and these other painters, they were depicting the wealthy class in a very brutal way, almost like showing, it was kind of the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie. So when you look at her pictures of the wealthy kind of people sitting in Nice, they look horrible. They look red-faced, even though it's black and white. You can tell they were alcoholics. But within the context of German expressionism, she's there. And that was a conversation that would never have happened in the photography world, which means that all those people, all those years, who collected German expressionism, Austrian expressionism, weren't collecting Lisette Modell. And those types of shows need to be done still, because we need to, as a community, connect with the other, not the 1% or 0.01% of the collectors out there that are photo collectors, but the other 99.99% of people that collect art that would consider photography if they understood how it might fit better. And things have changed. I'm not saying like this isn't already being done. The museums are doing a great job in integrating and so forth. But really what is not being done still is presenting photography as a leading art form, that where the photographer is the one influencing the others. And there are plenty of stories in history where that has been the case, starting with someone like Alfred Stieglitz, who had, such an enormous imprint on American modernism. So with this new space, I will be showing other artists in And it doesn't have to, they don't always have to be integrated with photography, but photography will always be a core of this gallery.
It was great speaking with Bruce about his journey to photography and his insights about the future of the medium. I really appreciated his enthusiasm and dedication to the field. Much like other guests I spoke with throughout the AIPAD collaboration this April, we really only scratched the surface of many topics. So you can look forward to hearing more from these guests again in the future. Let me know if you have a favourite or if there's anyone in particular you'd like to hear more from. And if you don't want to miss out on new episodes, please subscribe to Subtext Discourse Art World podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And if you know someone else interested in the overlap of photography in the art world, please send them a link to the show. Podcasting is obviously a broadcast medium, however I'm happy for listeners to reach out. You're welcome to follow me on Threads, Instagram, Blue Sky and LinkedIn at Michael Dooney. Otherwise, you can always go to my website, www.michaeldooney.net. There you'll also find the International Photo Festival database I put together, as well as my webinar for photographers and artists working in lens-based media to better understand the art marketplace and to get their work into galleries. That's all for now. Thanks again for tuning in. My name's Michael Dooney, and you've been listening to Subtext and Discourse.